Matthew Knittel, Director of Pennsylvania's Independent Fiscal Office, you put out a report about the state's finances. But first, let's talk about the sources the state pays its bills from. Let's start with the general fund.
Sure. So the general fund is the main state fund that's used for general purposes, generating about $45 to $46 billion. There's about 12 different revenue sources in the general fund, but the main ones are personal income, sales and use, and corporate net income taxes.
And there's something called the rainy day fund, too, that a lot of our viewers have heard about.
That's correct. So the rainy day fund is monies that are set aside for emergency purposes. Currently, that's about $7 billion. So a nice set aside right now.
And what might be considered an emergency you could use the rainy day fund for?
Sure. So the governor could declare an emergency, and to use those monies, I should note that it requires a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly. But let's say a very severe downturn might trigger the use of those funds, such as we had in 2008 and 2009 with the housing bust.
Now, how does the state maintain the rainy day fund? In other words, how much money has to go into it?
So at the end of every year, the general fund surplus, what's ever left over from that account, 10% of it will automatically be transmitted over to the rainy day fund.
So now that you mentioned the surplus, that's the last thing I want to examine here because I know that's an important component of your report. What are the rules for using the surplus?
So for the general fund surplus, there's no rules per se, and it rolls over from year to year. Currently, there's about $6.5 billion in that general fund surplus, and the good news is it's earning 5.25% interest. So just last year, the state of Pennsylvania earned $800 million of interest, and that remains in the general fund, so it can be used for general operating expenses.
Now, in our viewers' minds, there might be some overlap between the rainy day fund and the surplus. Is there, in fact, any overlap there?
I would say they're separate accounts. One might think of them as a checking account and a savings account, the rainy day fund being the savings account to be used for emergency purposes. But the general fund surplus, again, it's carried over from year to year. It could be used for general operating expenses.
Now, when the governor signed his new budget recently, how did that set the stage for activity within your office?
So the governor, at the beginning of last month, beginning of July, the budget was approved. And at that time, given that it had been approved, my office put out an update. So about 4 or 5 times a year, my office puts out projections of general fund revenues and spending. And once the numbers were locked in for this year and we closed the books on last year, we put out an update for the general fund spending, the general fund revenues, and then, of course, the projected deficit.
Now, the governor is going to increase spending by 5% in this budget that he just signed. That's 5% over last year. And just how significant of an increase is that?
I'd say it's a material increase. There's some pressures that are underlying that.
Material? What do you mean by material?
A little higher than normal, but some of that I would attribute to past inflation. So I'll give you an example. Last year, the wage contracts were ratified for state workers. And in those contracts, they're making up for lost time. That is, they're looking back at the high inflation from 2021, 22. And the idea is to compensate the state workers for the high inflation that occurred in the past few years. So that's one of the cost pressures in the budget, but again, that's just making up for the erosion of the spending power over the last several years.
Now let's get into the conclusions of your recent report that have to do with the surplus. And what does the current budget tell us about the next fiscal year, which would be 2026?
Yeah, so in our one-pager that we put out last month, what we found is that for last year, the operating deficit was about $900 million. For this current year, my office is projecting a deficit of $3.3 billion. And let me note that the governor's office is at $3 billion, so there's general consensus, general agreement that for this year, it's about $3 to $3.3 billion operating deficit.
Well, that sounds like a very significant increase to me, at least. And what accounts for that?
Yeah, so there's some cost pressures that are built into that. One, as I noted, being the ratification of the wage contracts, which again is just a catch-up from past years. There's also some federal monies that are no longer available, that mainly used for the Department of Human Services, that the state now needs to pick up for those costs. And for next year, Larry, to go back to your original question, my office is projecting a deficit of $4.5 billion.
And why that disparity then? And why do you have faith in your numbers? And why are they different than the governor's numbers?
Yeah, great question. So for this year, I'd say that we're on the same page. So even though it's $300 million, that's not a big disparity. One's at $3 billion deficit, and we're at $3.3 billion. For next year, the dynamic at work is that the spending is increasing by 4%, but the revenues are only increasing by 1.5%. And there are two factors driving that. One is a corporate rate cut that's ongoing. You know, we're phasing down to a lower corporate income tax rate. And the second factor is the item I had mentioned earlier. It's the interest that accrues on the general fund surplus. We had $780 million last fiscal year. We think that's going to fall to about $500 million this fiscal year as we run down that general fund surplus and the Federal Reserve reduces interest rates.
So were these consequences expected, or did they come as a surprise to the administration or your office for that matter?
I can't speak for the administration because they haven't made a forecast for next fiscal year. For my office, I can say it's not unexpected. So we had made a 5-year projection back in November. We do that every November. We had to put out a 5-year report. And at that time, it was clear to us that the temporary measures that were being used, and these are temporary federal monies, they would be exhausted. Consumers would deplete their excess savings, and everything would downshift. And I think we're beginning to see that downshift right now in the economy as we approach the election. There's a little bit of uncertainty. The sales tax collections are slowing down a little. The withholding tax collections are slowing down a little. So from our perspective, it's not unexpected.
When you mentioned the tax rate for businesses being lowered, were you talking about the CNI, the corporate net income tax rate? Because that is being ramped down as we speak.
That is correct. So it started at 9.99% before the rate cuts, and for this year, this tax year, it will be 8.49, and then it phases down to 4.99 by 2031.
So that sounds significant. Then just lowering that 4%, what an impact it seems to have on the state budget.
Yes, that's a material impact, I'd say, at least several $100 million that are no longer available going forward. And as I noted, there's also the interest that accrues on the general fund surplus, so maybe about $300 million less there as well.
So if we end up with a deficit of $1.5 million in 2026, is there anything Pennsylvania can do today to anticipate and prepare for that situation?
Yeah, so you're referring to our projection by next year.
Yes.
Yeah, we think the general fund surplus will be depleted and there'll be a shortfall of $1.6 billion. And if that does...
Oh, did I say million? Make it billion with a B.
Sure. And that, if that does happen, there's 4 ways that could be addressed. The first way is, of course, with additional revenues. So that could be a tax increase or new revenue sources like cannabis or skill games. That didn't make it into the budget this year, but they're still on the table. You could slow down the rate of spending. It doesn't have to be a spending cut, but we're projecting 4% spending increase. So if that just slows down to 1 or 2%, that could save some monies. There's also mechanisms that have been used in the past, pulling in additional monies from other accounts, other funds that the state has access to, or one could delay a payment. These are temporary measures to buy a little time. The final thing that could be done is the rainy day fund. As noted, that requires a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly to tap those funds.
Now, Politics PA reported that Pennsylvania cannot go into debt for its operating expenses, unlike the federal government. Didn't know that. Why is that the situation?
Yeah, that's definitely the case for operating expenses. Pennsylvania cannot borrow funds, and that's in the...
Is that true of other states?
Most other states that I'm aware of, I think nearly every state, that's also the case, that they're limited to that. There's one state that I can't recall that I think may be an exception, but the vast majority, they can't borrow for operating purposes.
So then keeping that in mind, then you have to think of a recourse that you can definitely count on then.
Yes, that's why...
It sounds like a dire situation if you have to do this.
We're just drawing attention to it, that it's out there, and we think it's very likely to occur, and just putting up the warning right now. So in order to, of course, craft policy, it's good to have a long lead time so the debate can occur and nothing's rushed through.
Now, is this likely a situation for the rainy day fund to possibly come to the rescue in 2026?
Yeah, it's unclear. I think it's more likely that some other measures will be taken. Perhaps some of these new revenue generators, cannabis and skill games, I think are more likely candidates to use to remedy that situation.
Does your office take positions on initiatives like that to raise revenue?
We don't take positions, but by statute, we're required to make a forecast of how much monies those proposals will raise, and we put those out in April. And we thought legalization of marijuana would be about $300 million, skill games, taxation, another about $300 million. So there are proposals there that are material revenue generators that could be used to address what we think will be a shortfall next year.
On a routine basis, how much communication is there between your office and the governor's office?
I characterize it as regular communication, both with the Budget Office and the Department of Revenue. We're always comparing notes, asking questions about what we're seeing in the data, how we interpret it. So I'd say it's very open, very collegial, not adversarial.
Here's what Representative Seth Grove had to say about the report that came out of your office. He said it's not a surprise, given the state's structural deficit. It seems like we can never have a conversation about the budget until the phrase structural deficit comes up. And please give us a simple definition of that concept.
Yes, that term comes up frequently. So structural deficit means that the economy is operating on all cylinders. So for Pennsylvania, that's an unemployment rate of about 4.5%, real growth of about 2%, inflation of about 2%. The other thing that needs to occur is there can't be any temporary measures or temporary monies. So, during COVID, we had a lot of temporary monies coming into the state. Those are largely exhausted. So right now, I'd say we're very close to normal operating conditions for the state economy, and we don't have any of these temporary monies.
Now, I'm thinking more about the concept of the structural deficit, and doesn't that suggest that there's some kind of a habitual systemic thing that just keeps recurring that ought to be changed? That's what I got out of it.
Yes, then that's accurate. When you use the term structural, what it means or implies is that a permanent change needs to take place, that a temporary measure won't address the situation. And a permanent change means either higher revenues or lower spending or a combination of the two.
Let's spend a few minutes on another report your office did, and it had to do with stadium economics. The report is about fans supporting Major League Baseball. And what is the value of doing a report like that?
So we received a request from two representatives from the western part of the state. Some of the leases for the stadiums are coming up for renewal in 2030. And the representatives were interested on the economic impact of both Major League Baseball teams and how they've done in the past and how they compare one against the other.
And, well, for instance, let's talk about the major cities and the major teams. What did the Pirates bring in spending-wise?
So the Pirates, we thought the economic impact, and this is a very broad measure of the economic impact, so it's really counting everything. We thought it was about half.
So is this tickets, hotels?
Yes.
Restaurants, bars?
Correct, merchandise, anything like that, transportation to and from the game. We thought it was about $500 million. And for the Phillies, about twice that, about $1 billion. But of course, that's a much larger market too.
And does the team's performance have an impact on how much money they generated? Did you notice this in your report?
Yes, we thought we could see it in the data looking at the last decade that there was a positive correlation between payroll, wins, attendance, and then economic impact.
And how much money does the state invest in general in Major League Baseball anyway?
I wouldn't say on an annual basis the state is actively investing. What they did was...
But it helps fund the construction of stadiums, right?
A lump sum amount when the stadiums were built, and that's what's up for discussion now. The state's looking at what is the return on investment from those monies, over a long period of time. So
last question, Matt, about your report. What does it say about Major League Baseball to taxpayers? What's the message you want them to get out of this?
Well, what I found surprising, and maybe I shouldn't have, is that for Pittsburgh, for the Pirates, a third of their fan base on any day is coming in from out of state. So they're pulling in monies from out of state that wouldn't otherwise be there.
Coming in from Ohio, I'm guessing?
Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland. So that's real monies that wouldn't be there otherwise. For Philadelphia, it's of course more like 40% because of Delaware and New Jersey. A lot of fans coming over and spending the monies in state. So that's all very positive.
Matthew Knittel, Director of Pennsylvania's Independent Fiscal Office, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Larry.